I don't have the real book yet.
I think it's great.
I love that. So we are on Facebook Live. We are being recorded. So hello, Zoe, and hello, Jennifer.
Hi.
How are you both?
Great.
Doing awesome. Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
So good to have both of you here. I can't wait for this conversation. So I'm going to give Facebook just a minute or two to let everybody know that we're here and that we're live, and to tell people a little housekeeping what's happening. So for those, I think we have both coasts covered. Zoe and I are coming to you from Southern California, and Jennifer is coming to you from North Carolina, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so hopefully we've got the coast covered, and hopefully we have some people from the middle joining us too. So those of you who are not familiar with Warwicks, I have a lot of people that join us that are regulars. So excuse me, you've heard me say this now for 18 months over and over and over again, but there might be somebody that doesn't know who Warwicks is who's watching this. So we're located in La Jolla, San Diego, California. And my little sign there says 1896. That's when we were established. So we're celebrating our 125th anniversary this year. So yay!
That's awesome.
Yep. So while we're not the oldest bookstore in the country, we're the oldest continuously family owned. So Nancy Warwick is our 4th generation owner. So I like to say, you know, we've seen a lot in those 125 years. A couple world wars, 2 pandemics. It was funny when TV was, so we talked about like the, you know, ebooks were going to like be the end of books, right? But real books were going to go away. Well, we were looking through the archives, and there was an article written about when TV first came and everybody was buying TVs, they were worried that books were going to go away. So we haven't gone away yet. So, speaking of books, we're here to talk about ARTCURIOUS today. And so I'm going to put Jennifer's book into the comment section of Facebook. If you're watching this recording on YouTube, there's nothing in the comment section, but you can just go to warwicks.com and type in the book, and you can easily order from us. But if you're on Facebook, I'll put that link in there. You can easily click it. If you're here in San Diego, we would love for you to come by the store. So click that pick up in store option. Or I'm here, we ship things out mainly media mail. You have other choices, but I'm hearing the media mail is not that bad. So it gets you quicker than you think. So I always like to say too, any way that there is to get a book, you can get it from Warwick's or your local independent bookstore. But so please support us or whatever bookstore you have near you. Jennifer and Zoe are going to talk for about 35-ish minutes today. And so if you have any questions, we encourage you to put those into the comment section, and I will bring those into the conversation after they are done chatting about Jennifer's book. So with that, I'll introduce you both and turn the show over to you two. The TV, I was got to talk about TVs earlier. Got the brain going in the wrong direction. So Jennifer Dasal is the curator of modern and contemporary art at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the host of the independent podcast ARTCURIOUS, which she started in 2016 and which was named one of the best podcasts by the Oprah magazine. Congratulations on that. And PC magazine. She holds an MA in art history from the University of Notre Dame and a BA in art history from the University of California, Davis. She has also completed PhD coursework in art history at Pennsylvania State University. She lectures frequently on art, both locally and nationally. And like I said, we're here today to talk about ARTCURIOUS, stories of the unexpected, slightly odd, and strangely wonderful in art history. Joining Jennifer today is Zoe Disigny. I said that right, I hope. Hey! Zoe holds a master's degree in art history and taught college courses for 30 years. She also worked as an art gallery director, a lecturer for the Norton Simon Museum of Art, and most recently as a lecturer for Rhodes Scholar, an educational travel organization for adults. Zoe's led numerous art tours in Europe and at one point established a business in Paris offering art history adventures for American tourists. That had to have been fun. Wish I would have been on one of those. She has published articles in Art Fiction and the Potato Soup Literary Journal. I love that name. And her debut novel, which is I think back there, The Art of Traveling Strangers, is scheduled for release in early 2022. So maybe we'll see you back here for that book release. All right. You two have a great conversation. We'll see you in about a half hour.
Thanks,
Thank
Julie.
you. Hi.
Hi. This is a thrill. I have to
I
tell
am
you, this
so
is an
excited.
absolute thrill. I'm honored. Thank you for inviting me to share this conversation with you.
Oh, it's
So-
such an honor to have you come and talk with me. So thank you. And I appreciate also that you are on West Coast time. This is not the latest book talk that I've done. I did one a couple of weeks ago that I think was at 10 o'clock my time. So this is pretty good, actually. So
Yeah.
thank you for joining me.
Well, okay, so I want to start off with a question for you, the burning question that I have as a fellow art historian. How did you find your way into the art world to begin with, and more specifically to art history, which is such a little part of the art world?
Yes, I love this question. And I love also to hear, I want to hear your story too, because I feel like it's not your obvious choice. It's definitely not your obvious career path. But so many people that I know who've ended up in the art world had an inkling about wanting to be in art in some manner early on, and it was not that way for me at all. I was the kid who was far more interested in science, and I was pretty certain that I was going to be a paleontologist or a geologist when I was a kid. And really that was the interest that carried me through all the way until middle of college, really. But when I was a freshman in college, just starting out, I needed to get a few of those humanity courses, just kind of checking off the box and getting them out of the way, because I was already thinking about getting all those requirements for graduation handled. And all of the classes that I wanted to take were all full. And so I could not get in them. And I ended up in an office of a course counselor who basically just very calmly said, we're going to just open the course catalog. We're going to see what's being offered, and we're just going to find something and see if it's available. And I mean, I've told this story so many times to mean that it feels like it's part of the lore now, but I see it in my mind as like a movie, because that's how it feels like in retrospect, because it became this fated moment. But in reality, it was this woman who I'd met for 5 minutes who flipped open a book, stopped at the letter A in the alphabetized listing, and she said, art history. Lots of people take art history. Let's just see if there's still room for you to register in. And I didn't want to. I was not interested at all. And I didn't even get to say like, no thanks, let's keep looking, because she just went right over to her computer, logged in, saw that there was space, and just hit enroll. And so I didn't even get to say no. I just all of a sudden was studying art history, and I was not excited about it. I went almost kicking and screaming. But then a couple of weeks later, I realized that it became very quickly the course that I was looking forward to the most. And it happened relatively fast because I had a great professor who was telling amazing stories about art. It was hard for me not to get sucked in. And that really was this fated moment that changed my life. And a couple of years later, I made it official, and I ditched the geology major and became an art history major, and just went through from there. So it's really funny because I would have never imagined myself on this career path. But I'm so happy that it found me. I didn't find it. It definitely found me.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I had a somewhat similar story. I was a sophomore in college and needed a general education requirement, took art history. I don't know why, maybe because it started with A, same thing. Thought it was great, went to Paris the next year, walked into the Jeu de Paume, the Impressionist Museum, and I walked up to the first painting I saw, which was Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. And the entire lecture of my professor came back into my head. At least I thought the entire lecture did. And that had never happened to me before, ever. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. This is it. So yeah, I
found
think
you too.
Find you. Yeah.
I know. It's always kind of shocking, and I'm a little bit jealous sometimes when I meet people who say, oh, I took art history when I was in high school and I loved it. I was like, oh, I would have loved to have had, even if I didn't actually do it, it's like such an amazing opportunity to learn about art at such a young age. It's something I did not have. And who knows, but I'm happy it found me the way it found me.
Yeah, no, I think that worked out real well.
You too.
So I have another burning question, and this is about your Art Curious podcast, which I think are fantastic. And they're fascinating, they're diverse, they have something for everybody. And I would have never in a million years come up with this idea. So how did you come up with this idea?
Oh, okay, so it's kind of a little bit of a long story, so I'll try not to drone on too much about it. But the actual impetus, there's two parts to the story. The first is that whenever I tell people that I meet for the first time, like at a dinner party or something, I say what I do for a living. Once I tell them that I work at the museum, I feel like people are split into two camps. There's always the people who say like, oh, the museum, I love the museum. I go all the time. I take my kids, we go to the movies, the concerts, the exhibitions, and they really tell me that they feel like art is a part of their life, or at least a part of their leisure time. And then there's the other half of the people, and they say, oh, the art museum. I've been here for 20 years. I've never been. I'm not interested. And it feels like I really fairly rarely meet people who sit in the middle and say, oh, I like art. It's cool. I like other things too. And moving on. It's like people seem to be really split on their feelings about art in general. And I always thought that that was funny, and also that I can completely relate, because I used to not be interested in art myself. So I always felt like I was sympathetic, and that I enjoyed meeting those people as much as I enjoyed people who really felt like they were so into art and art history in general. And whenever I would tell people my story, they'd be like, well, if you were once like me and not interested in art, how did you get to this point? And I told them, I had great people telling me really interesting stories about art. And for me, it began with the story. And the story was what got me into looking closer at the piece and wanting to learn more. And so thinking about that one day, I was on a plane. You're talking about going to Paris. I was going to Paris for a work trip for this, for an exhibition I was working on at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And I had a couple of days to kill in Paris. Like, out of all the places to kill some time, Paris is pretty great, right? And the first thing I thought of while I was sitting on the plane, I thought, this is great. I get to go by myself to some museums. And normally I have a young child in tow and my husband, who are both very, very supportive, but also I know that they don't want to be spending 8 hours at an art museum like I would prefer to do. So I thought, oh, I get to spend the day by myself at an art museum. It'll be great to go to the Louvre. I haven't been there in about 15 years, would love to go back. And so the moment I think of the Louvre, I think probably a lot of people just sort of have that picture of the Mona Lisa popping in their mind, because she's, its most famous denizen. And then it's just like this ping pong that goes through my mind. And I think about the Mona Lisa, and I think about this one particular day that happened in one of those undergraduate art history courses, where my professor was talking about what was important about the Mona Lisa, why she's such a draw really at the Louvre, and why everybody seems to know her face. And then she said, in passing, you can go see her. She's on the wall at the Louvre. If you go to Paris someday, you'll have the opportunity to go and look at her in person. And she paused for just what felt like, it was probably 10 seconds, but for me, it seemed like this immense eternity. And she just said, but if you don't go, it's okay, because the one that they have at the Louvre is fake. And I remember sort of stopping and saying, what? I think I turned to my friend who was sitting next to me, and I looked at her like, is this a joke? I didn't quite understand what was going on in that moment. And that was when I had this realization that my professor was being serious. She actually fully believed that this was a reproduction and not the real Mona Lisa painted by Leonardo da Vinci. And that stuck with me. And she really just kind of glossed over why she felt that way. She talked about it for maybe just a few seconds and said, oh, it was stolen a few times. First time it was stolen by a known art forger. So you can imagine that if they made all these copies, they definitely ended up with the copy back at the Louvre and not the original, which is still floating around somewhere. And I never really talked to her about it. This professor ended up being my thesis advisor. So you think that I would have sat down and asked her to kind of expand on this theory, but I'd never forgotten it, because it just seemed like such an odd story. And so when I was on this flight, I thought, I want to know more about that. I want to know why she felt that way. And even without thinking about the potential fakery of the Mona Lisa. I was just learning about that first big theft in 1911 of the Mona Lisa, and this kind of hunt that happened for almost 2 years, or a little more than 2 years. And all I could think about is, I've been studying art history for almost 20 years, and I don't know much of the details about this. This is fascinating. And as somebody who loves podcasts, I thought this would be an interesting thing to talk about on a podcast. And it was that quick. In retrospect, I think it's kind of funny because I had no audio experience and nothing of a storytelling background. I write, but it wasn't a, like a narrative kind of writing. It was just really nonfiction writing, catalog entries and writing wall labels for museum stuff, which is very different than writing a story. So it was kind of an odd choice, but I thought, this can't be that hard. I'm just going to talk into a microphone and then I'll put it out on the internet. And that's all. That's pretty much all the thought that went into it. I very quickly learned that there's a lot more to it and that it takes a lot of time. So this has really developed into my second full-time job over the past few years.
It must be. I'm amazed.
But I love it too. And that's the thing, is I think it is a lot of work. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of research, but I keep finding reasons to keep going. And I keep finding new art that I don't know anything about, stories that are really exciting to me. So I keep doing it because it makes me happy. And I hope it makes other people happy too, or at least it brings them something in their lives that's a positive thing.
Well, I'm definitely a fan. Definitely a fan. So I'm so glad you did it.
Thank you.
So since you brought up the Mona Lisa, your chapter in the book that talks about her is, what you were just saying, your curiosity was piqued by what your professor said.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really like what you do in your book, you do it several times, but in this chapter you do it as well, where you bring up a conspiracy theory, and then you question it, and then you debunk it, and then you question it again, and then you let the reader decide, which is marvelous, because then you have to think as a reader, which is always so much more interesting to me. So at the end of that chapter, you talk about, well, is it fake or is it real? What's really on the wall? So if you were in charge of the Louvre and you had the opportunity to make that decision, what would you do? Put the fake one up or the real one?
Oh, I think in some ways, I agree with you. I like that you see it as a positive. In some ways, when I was writing this chapter, and also I think a couple of other chapters in the book, that I do pose these questions, but then I don't necessarily give you the answer. I feel like it's a little bit of a cop-out in some ways, because
I don't.
But at the same time, I'm glad you like
We
that.
don't always know the answers.
Yeah, you can't know for sure. That is the thing. I don't think we can ever know for sure if any painting is a real deal, as much as a museum says so. If it's their star attraction like the Mona Lisa, it would probably be a little bit of bad press to all of a sudden have to announce that it's not the real thing. And so you're going to do, I would think, in many cases, it might not be the most ethical way to go forward, but I can see how you want to spin things very carefully. At the same time, I feel like art is art, a book, a phone, they're all just objects, right? As much as we are the ones that put the value upon them. So the value for me of art is really the fact about how it's treated and how we perceive it. And going to see a work on the wall of a museum completely changes it in my mind. It's really us having that experience with a work in person that gives it so much value. Because if the Mona Lisa was just sitting on someone else's wall and we didn't get the chance to go see it, I don't think it would be as much of a big deal. It's really been built up so much. And I think having a work in the public sphere is so integral to what makes it incredible. So I would want to put the real deal on the wall, but I can so see the urge to wanting to just really hedge your bets and keep that literal priceless piece of art safe. I see it both ways so easily, I think.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of it makes me think of the Lascaux caves, where you can't go into the cave anymore because we were destroying it as people going through. And but they did a copy, that you can
Yeah.
experience, but they told you it's a copy. So I think that would be the thing. If you were really going to do that and protect the real thing, that you should let people know that that's what it is. And then if people know that's what it is, then I think I wouldn't want to go see the copy. I'd want to see the real thing. So I'd put the real thing up.
Right, exactly. I'm glad we're on the same page.
We are definitely
I
on the
know.
same page.
And
So-
it is interesting.
What?
I think it's interesting, actually, you bringing up the Lascaux copy, because I have never been, but I feel like I would go see the copy. But
Yeah.
I agree, it's like the power, it's not there. Going into the cave itself, I can imagine that would just be incredibly breathtaking.
And of
But
course,
going to
this
see
is
the copy,
Yeah, but this is a 3-dimensional copy. So I think that's a little
That's
bit different than a 2-dimensional one, since we can always reproduce those in a lot of ways, but you really have to be in a 3-dimensional one. So yeah, I might be a little bit different. So
yeah, I agree.
okay, so we know that the Mona Lisa was a podcast episode, and that's in your book, but I know there's lots in your book that are not from your podcast. So do you have a sneak peek for us about a new story that's in your book?
Yeah, I trying to think of ones that are, a few of them are my favorites. And I think probably my favorite chapters from the book ended up being these new ones that I wrote. One of my favorites it's just basically my favorite because it's silly. And it is a chapter that's on Hieronymus Bosch. And so Hieronymus Bosch, Flemish Renaissance painter, and very well known for one particular work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which is this 3-paneled a triptych that is in the Prado in Madrid. And I think a lot of people, especially if you didn't grow up with art and you'd never seen a Hieronymus Bosch painting before, it strikes you almost immediately. It's kind of revelatory in its bizarreness. The first time I saw it, I was sort of unprepared for its oddness. And I remember just being enthralled, because if any of our listeners have seen this work, they're probably nodding right now. But if you haven't had the chance to see this, definitely look it up, Google it, because the closer you can zoom in, the more you see something new, something different, and something sillier and stranger. It's a scene that shows like the Garden of Eden, Earth, the Garden of Earthly Delights, and then a hellscape. And the hellscape to me is the most ridiculous, because it's not like anybody's having a great time. It's still all supposed to be torture, but the manner of the torture and the goblins and kind of little demons that are doing the torturing are just a little bit ridiculous. So it's a great work of art to look at and talk about anyway. But what I ended up writing the chapter about was about a decade ago almost. This woman who was in college in Oklahoma was a music major. And after she first saw The Garden of Earthly Delights in a class and was talking about it, decided that she needed to take a closer look. And what she did, she found this little tiny figure in the hellscape that had his bare rear end shown and kind of facing us, the viewers, and musical notes were written across them. And I think most of us would probably be like, oh, okay, musical note guy, got it. And she paused and she said, well, I can transcribe that into music. I wonder what it sounds like. And so she took that extra step, and it's like 5 bars. It's not a long symphony by any means. It's just little notes here and there. But then she put it out in the world, released it in a little WAV file, and all of a sudden it sort of blew up on the internet, and even made, it just became this funny thing. And I love that, because I think so many of us in the art world, and definitely outside of it as well, we see art as being so serious, like it's art. You have to be very quiet, almost like you have to treat a museum like a library, where you have to be very silent and respectful. And I don't think that's always true. I want you to be respectful of the art, of course, but I don't think it needs to be treated so seriously and so reverently all the time. And Bosch, I think, is an artist who subversively in some ways added humor into his work. And the humor actually gets us to stick in front of it longer and to look at it closer, because you just want to see what else is in there that is going to be kind of wacky. So that was definitely one of my favorites in this book.
Well, that's just hysterical. And that's such a good painting to talk about on so many levels.
You can never get bored of that painting.
Yeah,
I don't
no,
think.
never. But you know, the one of my favorites in your book is and it blew me away, is the chapter on the CIA and the abstract expressionists and their propaganda assets inventory.
Yes.
I just thought, I mean, talk about thinking something's funny. I just thought that was too absurd to be true. So I want to know where you found that story and what you felt about it when you first heard it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love this question. It's such a good one because I have to confess that I did not know the story. And it was in the first year of doing the podcast. I had done, oh my goodness, probably only about 6 or 7 episodes. I was maybe getting to the first 5 or 6 months of having the podcast out there. So it was still very small. I was still really receiving what I thought would be most of my listeners would be my family, my friends, and I didn't expect to have much of a following. And one day, very clearly remember this day, I received an email from a random listener, somebody who I hadn't met, and said, "Love the podcast. I have a great story for you. Do you know about the CIA supporting abstract expressionist painting to fight the Cold War?" And I said, "No, I don't. I have no idea what you're talking about." And this man sent me some links and I started Googling around and realized that this was a real thing. It was not a conspiracy theory because it completely sounds to me like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And also so bizarre. It's like, who would choose abstract painting as a weapon against communism and socialism, really? It seems so random, but basically it was done and it was only declassified, I think, in the 90s, late 90s. And it was this idea that visual art could show so clearly the freedoms that capitalist societies in the US in particular had, in that artists could create anything they wanted. It didn't have to be for a specific agenda. It didn't have to have this like social realist appearance. It wasn't meant to be praising a particular way of life. You could just splatter some paint and that was good. And people liked it. And so the idea was that they would send these traveling exhibitions of American art, but especially abstract, and then especially later abstract expressionist art, around to countries throughout the world, but especially ones who seemed like they were a little bit on the fence between wanting to go the capitalist route or the communist route. So are you going to support the US or are you going to become involved with Russia? And it's crazy. This happened for about almost, I think, 20 or 30 years. It was something that had a longer timeline to it, but it was very much kept at a distance so that it was done obviously it was through the CIA. So it was very secretive in that they put up these fake companies and fake organizations to back these exhibitions when the funding was really coming from the government, but it didn't look like it to people unless they were looking super duper close. It was kept at a remove, which I think is really interesting because a lot of the artists that ended up being shown in these exhibitions were not super keen on things like that, on being, government supported. And in some cases, I'm thinking about Barnett Newman was like very much an anarchist. So I can only imagine that him being involved in something like this, that would not have sat right with him, I don't think.
No,
So,
I don't think so. But how clever.
I know, it's such an interesting
idea.
Story. And I think, I don't know if you've listened to this podcast, but there was a podcast that came out, I can't even remember if it was through NPR or Slate or who did it, but about a year ago, there was a podcast series called Wind of Change that was towing that same kind of line, but about the 1980s, where it was talking about the use of music as this propagandistic message as well. And so that the arts in general, the creative space, has been used in this way, but oh my gosh, it was a revelation to me. And also I think these things are embarrassing a little bit when I learned them, because it's like, oh, I can't believe there's this gap in my knowledge that I never knew that this was a thing. But
It's also interesting because I don't think of our government, compared to maybe many other countries, as really being all that, out there supporting the arts, with such gusto, and yet they're using it undercover and supporting it. So that's just such a weird thing to find out. So really
It is
strange.
so weird. And then it was kept so, so secret for so long that even after the program ended, it was still kept under lock and key for about 30 years. So it was really a surprise, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I
So
agree with you, thinking about the NEA and,
yeah,
all the problems with that over the last few decades.
yeah,
It is surprising to think that this was such a part of that.
yeah, yeah. It's like we have two faces.
Yes, totally.
Okay, so now another question for you. This is another one where I want to know how you would answer it, because these are questions you pose in your book. So with Georgiana Houghton and
Yes.
with Hilma af Klint, I did not know anything about Houghton at all. So I read your book and once again was embarrassed. I didn't know anything about her. Hilma af Klint,
Same.
I did. And that was just wonderful to read. But you brought up the idea that there's pushback on the idea that Georgiana was actually an earlier abstractionist than who we think was Kandinsky. And
Yes.
that the reason is because abstract art is supposed to have no meaning. So you talk about it in the book, but I'd like you to talk about it now, because I want to know what you think about that.
This is a really tricky one. And it was something that I was struggling with when I was writing the book, because I don't necessarily agree that art for art's sake, abstraction needs to mean nothing, because I think it can evoke anything. That's sort of the thing about abstraction, is I feel like in some ways it's a black hole and the artist can project anything or nothing upon it, but then we as viewers can do the same. So who gets to say that it's a work of art that has no meaning? I just feel like that's such an odd definition. And I feel like even Kandinsky, if Kandinsky was the first abstract artist, I would be pretty sure that he would think his work of art meant something in some way.
It
So
did.
it's really an interesting argument, and kind of a ridiculous one in my my personal opinion. But yeah, that was the argument against these women who were using art really as a way to connect with the spiritual world. So these were two artists who both very separately did not know each other, did not work together, but were both involved in the spiritualism movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was almost as if for a while, both of them were using painting as a sort of automatic writing. So just automatic painting, I suppose you could say, or automatic drawings, where they were channeling a spirit and then creating artworks. Hilma af Klint backed away from that in the later part of her career, but I think Georgiana Houghton really embraced it the entirety of her career, and even said that she was channeling some famous artists like Titian, for example, which I think is also super interesting, that she's picking like a big name, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I disagree with the argument that those works can't be abstract because they have a particular genesis or a meaning behind it. I think it's kind of silly.
I thought that was a bogus argument too, because Kandinsky wrote on the spiritual in art. So he had a spiritual quality in his work. And then theosophy was a really big deal in the early part of the 20th century. And a lot of artists were putting that in their work, and they're considered to be non-representational abstract artists. So I don't know about yeah, I'm with you on that one. Absolutely with you on that one.
And I think I mentioned it briefly at the end of that chapter. I'm getting my chapters confused. It might be at the end of another chapter. It's all a blur. But in some ways, I think that pushback, it might be a little bit old school, but I also almost feel like it's a little bit misogynistic. And I could be wrong. That just might be that I'm coming at it from a more feminist perspective. But sometimes I feel like there's this pushback against wanting to help redefine or reclaim some firsts, especially in art history. And that if you take it away from whoever the original artist is supposed to be, especially if that artist is a white man, sometimes people can get a little bit nervous about that. Yeah. And I understand, and it's hard to change the narrative. It's hard to switch. Even for me, I've been studying art. I've been working in art for about 25 years now. And it's hard to all of a sudden have to switch tactics and relearn things and reconsider new things. especially with history, I think sometimes history is not dead. History is ever evolving, but sometimes it feels like it's not, like it's set in stone. And art, I think, is no different, art history.
Yeah, I agree.
So I get the nerves, but I don't know if that's really at play or not, or if it's just my interpretation of those kind of criticisms.
Well, I think it's a really poor argument. So I don't know. If it's a poor argument, then I'm not gonna go for it. But the
Right.
other one though that you bring up in there, which I also found interesting, and this one I think is a little bit more meaningful maybe, is the idea that, are you really a pioneer abstractionist if you have no followers? And because how can you be a pioneer and lead the way if nobody's following you?
I know.
And I found that one a little bit more potentially valid, but I'm not real sure. But so I wonder what you're thinking about that.
I feel like that one is a little bit rough, because I agree with you. It's almost like the idea of pioneering is that you have to be in the lead. I don't know. That one I feel really torn on, because I totally agree with you. But at the same time, I get that you want to have that representation of something, and that you have something to back it up with. So if say that in 1850, somebody, we don't know who, but somebody created this first completely non-representational painting and no one knew about it. You can't claim that person as the first, because we just don't have any information or proof or of surviving work. And so it's hard to be able to do that. You have to have something to point to, some documentation in some way. So I agree with you. It's like that needs to come from somewhere. And typically it comes from a follower or an appreciator of some sort. That one's hard for me. I agree. It's real rough.
And then it comes in the question about that they were women, and that was that could have been part of it too. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
We could go talking and talking all night. This is so great.
Thank you.
I love it. We do have a question coming in from Joan. Hi, Joan, and lots of great comments. She loves the book. She wants to know, Jennifer, what is your favorite piece of art? That's a tough question.
It is. I was just about to say, I love this question, and I don't hate it, but I like, it's so hard, because it's like, what day is it? How am I feeling today? And what did I have for lunch? I feel like it changes all the time. Feel like I have a favorite in almost every time period or every genre. I think it's easier for me to point to favorite artists. I have a lot of them, but I could say that a lot of my favorite artists are from France, from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, because those are a lot of the periods that I found most exciting when I was first coming up in art history. So a couple of my favorites are Rosa Bonheur, who was a French painter, really popular in her lifetime, but sort of got forgotten a little bit after her death, until she was very much, I think she's a big artist still even now, even though she's not maybe a household name, but she painted animals. So she was called an animalier, an animal painter. And she was such a cool person in her personal life. And so I tell you, if you haven't heard about her or read about her, I definitely say you should look her up. The other is that I really love Elizabeth Vijay Lebron. It's become sort of a joke, I guess, amongst my podcast listeners, because I'm always talking about her and I always seem to bring her up, and it's like, oh, she's going to talk about her again. But I love her. She was the court portraitist to Marie Antoinette. And so you get all like the juiciness of the late end of the French monarchy, the beginning of the French Revolution. And this woman went on not only to be an amazing artist, but she had a huge career. She lived into her 80s and painted everywhere, all over Europe, really engaged with the aristocracy all throughout Europe. And she survived the revolution, which for somebody who was so closely linked to the Queen of France is kind of a surprise. She did have to sneak out after dark and kind of hightail it out of Paris. So she escaped, I suppose I should say. But it's an awesome story for sure.
That sounds like a makings of a good historical novel.
Oh, Definitely.
That
I'm
story
sure.
sticking.
I know.
Somebody needs to like climb onto that, because that sounds like it's a great, just her whole life sounds like it would make a great historical novel for sure.
She's a winner.
Yeah. Somebody's on here saying love Rosa Minions League. So
Yay.
yay. Yay. I have a couple questions about the book.
Yeah.
I love the cover. So let's talk the cover. Did you have anything to do with that, or was that Penguin that did all that?
No, I'm so blessed in that I was working with Penguin, because they have such an incredible team of people. And so the only thing that I was involved in is that they sent me options and said, here's what we're thinking. Do you like these? And I got to vet some options. And I had to come back to this one at first because I said, I wasn't sure at the very beginning what was going on. And I was like, is this the person who's stealing the painting? Because there's only one chapter in the book that talks about art theft.
Right.
And then they had to come back to me and they said, oh no, it's the work of art is walking. The work of art is alive. The piece is like kicking up its heels and dancing. And all of a sudden I said, oh my gosh, now I love it. It just really changed it for me.
Yeah, but absolutely.
I'm glad you like it. I feel like it's got that graphic punch that's really fun.
I do too. And it could have gotten to where it's like you when you deal with an art book that's about art, you have to, there's lots of different ways it can go. I think they did a really good job. Blythe is on here asking, can you repeat the name Rosa ? Can you repeat the name?
Oh, yes, Rosa Bonheur. And let me go ahead. I can even write it in the chat. I don't know.
I can copy it into Facebook.
And then you can copy it into Facebook. Bonheur.
Okay, so I will put that into Facebook for you. There you go. Okay. And then my next question about the book is, what do you want people to take away from it? What's your goal for somebody reading this?
That is a great question. I would say I want you to be entertained first and foremost. I want you to, I guess, engage with it as you would maybe any interesting story about anything. But if you learn something new along the way, for me, that's golden. I feel like that's just the cherry on top of the sundae. But really, I meet so many people, as I mentioned in my first part of the conversation with Zoe, I meet so many people who think that art in some way is for other people. It's for anyone else but them. And art has gotten a bad reputation over the years, very fairly, of being very elitist and not maybe representing all people in all societies.
Right.
So I get it. I totally get it. And I wholeheartedly disagree. I think art is for everyone.
Right.
And it is, hopefully, I wish it could be enjoyed by everyone, which is why I'm so into museums that allow free access and free entry. Not a big fan of ticketed art museum. I get it. I work in a museum, so I understand all sides, but the more that people can go and see work, the more that they can find something that is meaningful for them. And so sometimes I think, here's an interesting story. Maybe it can lead you to finding your work of art, your particular thing that interests you.
And there definitely is something, like you said earlier in the conversation. I mean, you can look online, you can do things, but there's something about experiencing that in person. There's something about experiencing art in person that it's just not the same as on TV or on a computer. So there is that. Zoe, I want to find out, tell us a little bit about your book. I know it's coming, but what can you share with us?
Okay, so it's called The Art of Traveling Strangers, and it is about an art historian whose name is Claire. She's going through a terrible time, series of losses. She wants to escape her reality, and so she takes a job with this woman who she doesn't know. She's a little quirky, and she's going to be her art guide through Europe. So they go to Europe, and Claire's woes, of course, follow her there, which then these two mismatched women find themselves on this unexpected, life-changing adventure all through the art-filled cities of Italy and then on to Paris.
I love it. So I'm taking it that there's lots of like good art history that might be sprinkled in there a little bit.
And I can
sneaky of me, I know.
I can fully vouch that I have read the book in advance, and it is great and so fun. And I'm already thinking about it as like the perfect summer summer read and something for everyone who likes a great story again and loves art. I mean, it's perfect.
Well, and I think that there's a hunger for that in the book club world, because a lot of the, Girl with the Pearl, there is those classic books that center around art that were book club classics. So it sounds like it's the perfect book club book.
Oh, well, that'd be wonderful.
There you go. And Zoe, so if people want to find out more about you, do you have a website that you can direct people to?
I do. It's just my name, zoedesigny.com.
Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect.
I
So
have
that'd be-
I have a free chapter if somebody wants to get a sneak peek. So
Excellent. Okay. And then Jennifer, for you, you've got the Art Curious podcast. Is there another website or something that you can direct people to if they want to find out more?
Yeah, just artcuriouspodcast.com. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all that at ArtCuriousPod. And yeah, that's it. I'm always there.
Art Curious. Okay, perfect. It's been so much fun having both of you. This was a great conversation.
I've
Thank
loved
you
it.
so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you. It's been
Zoe,
wonderful.
great questions. You're awesome.
Great questions.
There's more.
I know. Like I said, we could have gone on for a little bit longer. Part 2. Maybe
Yes.
we'll have the reverse of this when Zoe's book comes out. You guys
Oh,
can
wouldn't that be fun? That'd be
I would
great.
love that. No pressure, but I would
No
love
pressure,
that.
but we'll talk about that when that comes out. We'll do a reverse and you guys can ask questions back. Save
That
some
would
more
be
of those
great.
questions. Great having both of you. we're going to say goodbye to Facebook and the recording. So you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Julie.
Bye.
Thank you.